Perseverance really is that thing where if this thing doesn't work, you just got to try something else. If you don't even have an idea, just do it.
Welcome to this week's As Unexpected podcast, when we talk to C-suite executives, entrepreneurs, and philanthropists about how they lead into the future when the future generally goes as unexpected. I'm Scott Marshall, your host, and my own professional experience has made me a believer that it's not how you show up when all goes as planned, but it is how you show up when things go as unplanned. Given all of their experiences, each of our guests has become very attuned to the fact that the future is not to be predicted. My hope is that this podcast can help all of you become better leaders by building the core leadership capabilities for leading in an uncertain world. Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the As Unexpected podcast. I'm your host, Scott Marshall, and I'm just so excited that Alexander Kotler has joined me today. Alex and I have spent time together over coffee in New York City, and it's so awesome now to spend time with him remotely, but through this podcast avenue. Alex, thanks so much for joining. I'd love for you to start off by introducing yourself, your professional background, and your current role with our audience.
Happy to. So good to be with you. Thank you for this wonderful invitation. So currently, I'm the Chief Revenue Officer at RubyLaw. We are a marketing technology platform serving law firms of all sizes. We help their marketing and business development teams manage, edit, publish, and maintain the integrity of the abundant and dynamic content that they create. I'm also a principal at Al Community, an advisory firm supporting rapidly scaling startups, and we work with their teams to galvanize deeper connections between their customers, commercial offerings, and their people to deepen engagement and reduce churn. And third, I do a lot of different things. I am a fledgling real estate investor looking to enhance the guest and resident experience within properties in my portfolio. And also mentioned, sorry, Scott, I do also live in New York City, and I have a wife, and I have two young boys, one aged 6, turning 7 in a couple of days, and aged 5.
I was going to say, I know that you are deeply committed family man, and I'm wondering how you do all of those other major efforts while so deeply committed to your family. That's quite the basket full of activities.
Thank you. I think the short answer is sleep is overrated, but it is true. I try to have as large of a plate and fill it with as much as I can, and there's very little time in between.
Indeed. I love it. We got to live it to the fullest. So, Alex, as you know, the title of this podcast has deep meaning to me, and all my guests bring great stories around that deep meaning. Title is As Unexpected. And now I'd love for you to start off the podcast by sharing with our listeners a story or two about how you as a leader have faced circumstances, contexts that have been as unexpected, and how you showed up as a leader, not only for yourself, but for those around you.
I would love to do that. Would it help, Scott, if I outlined a quick background on my career and tell you how I've gotten to where I am? What's interesting, and of course, I am a semester at sea alum. 25 years ago, fall 1998 was when my voyage was, but my career has been as much of an odyssey as that was. And I'll break it down into 7 very discrete and fast chapters. So the first one, post-semester at sea, I was interested in 2 things, photography and travel. I became a photo assistant in New York City, and then a consultant for a deluxe global tour operator. Chapter 2, post 9/11, so I'm dating myself a little bit, I returned to school to pursue another passion, graphic arts, and became a creative consultant for the New York Daily News and Sony. Chapter 3, I then went to business school to introduce some analytical rigor to my visual arts training. 4, the recession of 2008 hit. So unexpectedly for me, part of that theme, of course, I pursued a path of entrepreneurship, creating a business-to-business network for soccer industry professionals. 5, I then transitioned into nonprofit to launch a global fundraising initiative for UNICEF, which is where I will share one of the unexpected stories for our listeners. Chapter 6, I left nonprofit, moved into the corporate management and brand consulting space. And finally, 7, where I am today, technology, where I am leading the go-to-market team for RubyLaw.
And how many of those steps along the path were planned, predictable?
Probably one out of all of them. And that might have just been at the beginning when I got out of semester at sea, got out of college, was like, I think I know I want to be a photographer. And that was before I understood what it meant to truly be a photographer. And I realized, I don't know if I can truly do this. And so that has, I suppose, traveled with me on my professional journey. And later on, I can get into the tenets of my personal philosophy, which will share, I think, why and some of the missteps potentially as I've gone along of lacking some of the professional vision that I might have wanted to actually steer or direct my journey, as opposed to having some of it be a little bit more whimsical, which has made it quite magical and has exposed me to what I truly think is what drives me, and that is a diverse set of interests and different kinds of experiences which make up the whole of who I am.
I don't know how to unpack all of that, but I'm going to use what I think is a very oversimplified metaphor and not accurate in terms of neuroscience. But you clearly have exercised the left and right brain through your career. You've exercised the artistic part as well as the analytical part. And I think that probably is the heart and soul of what has led you on this magical journey, which is your professional and personal life. I love it.
Yeah, it's really interesting that you talk about left and right brain. I remember distinctly there was a period of time in my life where I worked for Lippincott, which is best in class brand strategy and experience, brought brands like Betty Crocker and others like Duracell to life that you've heard of. And during this period of time, I remember we would always pitch on left and right brain. And that was one of the best practices and special sauce ingredients that that organization brought to market. And potentially also one of the reasons why at the time I felt so at home there, because it always resonated with me, the left and right brain coming together to provide really as much engagement and action and intelligence to serve clients as possible.
Awesome. All right, let's get to your story, your as unexpected story.
Yeah, so here is this one, and it's multi-layered. I'll provide a little bit of context. I was hired as a member of the enterprise partnerships team at the U.S. Fund for UNICEF, and I was charged with launching a global initiative in support of UNICEF's mission in a simplified way, that is being to help children survive and thrive. The program was funded by a grant made by a donor, and for 6 months, we worked with a leading management consulting firm, not one that I wound up working with later, a different one, as well as UNICEF's regional boards to develop a digital platform designed to engage small and medium enterprises in the mission of UNICEF. And so we developed this business strategy, this infrastructure, business processes, a name for the program, content, a newsletter, a podcast, a launch strategy. And this is what was unexpected. We turned it on, and all of a sudden, this program is live. And the expectations of leadership was that donations were going to start plowing in. Now, all of a sudden, you turn the faucet on and the water should come through. And that was not what happened. I didn't expect this to be the expectation of leadership. And what also wound up happening, which I also didn't expect, was that the organization in time opted to sunset the program. And as a result, my boss, my mentor, the person who is now a leading CEO at an organization, was let go. And this was devastating for me. I remember I ran into his office. I was like, I'm going to resign now. And I realized I still had rent to pay, and I couldn't make such a bold decision and follow my heart in quite the way that I wanted to.
So you did say that that's a multi-layered story, and I'd like to work through a couple of those layers with you. First of all, you said you didn't expect what the leaders expected. Fascinating, right? So this is clearly a major effort that you've undertaken. You've talked about all the component parts of this effort. It launches, and there's still a mismatch of expectations. Can you back up through that process and tell us what learning came for you and for others around you through that?
True. I think it's obvious, and I love how you heard specifically what it is. When I get to my personal philosophy, I think that it comes forward here now. And that is, you have to define what success looks like from the start. So for me, success was taking something that hadn't had a path. There was no map to follow. This was something that had to materialize. And this was part of the vision and the due diligence process that we did working collaboratively. But I don't think that the definition of success, which we knew was a fundraising goal, had a time limit to it, had deadlines attached to it, and had properly articulated how we were going to actually achieve that. And so looking back on it now, plenty of that responsibility can potentially fall on my own shoulders. And it is also the type of thing that I charge myself and my teams and anyone that I'm working with, is define what success looks like. And let's be very clear on how we're going to get there. And this is even something that came to me recently through someone that I work with, which is, let's also be able to diagnose what went wrong and know ahead of time why it's going to go wrong or why it went right, so that we're sitting here in 6 months looking back, feeling like we were able to forecast this outcome.
Oh boy. I got so many directions. I'm trying to pick one to go from here. So define success, right? So you want to really understand what that future state is that you're seeking. And not only for you and not only for your team, but for the leadership as well. Like, everybody needs to be surrounded by a common understanding of what success looks like. And how then do you manage all the dynamism, all the unpredictability and uncertainty and ambiguity that goes along the path to those outcomes?
In our case, we documented as much as we could. And I think you want to outline this. And for me, this is very much part of my process. I do like to work with documentation. I like to have everything outlined ahead of time. I then like to populate it with something. And this documentation is the kind of thing you can look back on and memorialize everything so that you're able to track your progress against it. I think that that's why and how. And you should also take some educated guesses, if possible, to be able to see what might go wrong at what point in time. Obviously, we don't necessarily know what those things may be, when they may happen, but usually, and I don't have numbers to put against this, there is probably a standard deviation or a range that you can expect the unexpected to happen within.
Yeah, I love that. Within our organization over the last year, we've really infused into our culture objectives and key results. It's not an organization that historically has used those kind of methods, even though we have a very clear financial outcome that we seek, right? We seek kids, college adults sleeping in beds as a revenue number. It's really clear. And to your point, there's so much in the external environment that influences the feasibility of those. So we have to feel comfortable with ranges. And that's even against having to set a budget for the next year.
It's all of those things. It is looking at your quota number. I mean, obviously, I oversee revenue. So it's the percentage of quota attained versus what you didn't and why. And then understanding the activities that you're performing against that quota and determining whether or not these are the right activities, and whether, if you continue doing them, it's going to lead the result that you're seeking, which of course is quota attainment or exceeding that quota in a better circumstance.
Right. And when you're working with your team now as Chief Revenue Officer, I'm sure you have a fiscal year, you manage against that fiscal year, you got to set goals against that year, but you're not publicly held, right?
No. We're privately held, and we were actually, this is part of my journey. One of the stories that I might have told, which I suppose now I will allude to now, is that we were acquired. It was part of our strategy. And there were many things that unexpectedly happened along the way. Of course, the economic climate changed as we were going through the process. That is something that you certainly can't forecast, or you can't forecast a pandemic, any of these things and the implications and the fallout as a result. And so we were managing this through that process. We eventually were acquired. It was successful, but it wasn't the first time that was successful. There were at least 3 failed attempts to get us to that place where we would be able to achieve what our outcome was. And we had one evening that I remember early in the process that we had a particular suitor and we were expecting an offer to come in by a particular time and we were expecting it to have a particular number. And in my head, I was thinking about all of the ways that my life was potentially going to change and the apartment in Miami or wherever it might have been that we were thinking about adding to our portfolio. And then, of course, when that offer didn't come in, then there you are. And you have to really get yourself back up off the ground and save face and remotivate yourself to get back in the game, because obviously that was an unexpected blip that could have changed our fortunes and ultimately did change our fortunes, but ultimately for the better. And our company is for the better for it based on how everything turned out.
Definitely want to exercise this point more right here, Alex. So that was clearly quite a hit to the team, was unexpected. And reasonably, you all probably were thinking, when this is done, just think of what we get to do afterwards. But what is the core trait with you and those around you who got back up? Like, how do you recover? Because in life, we're all dealing with things that are unexpected. It could be our own health. It could be the health of a loved one. It could be a pandemic. It could be tight employment circumstances and an inability to hire. There's so many things that are going on that go as unexpected. How do you keep showing up to finally achieve that goal?
Yeah, great question. This probably ties into the 5 tenets of my personal philosophy. I think that this is one specific one, but describing myself, as I've actually never done publicly, and part of the exercise and even preparing for this conversation, it was important to me to outline this. I think that this is one aspect of it, and it's probably different for everyone. And there also may be different threads that everyone seems to follow or adhere to in their own personal philosophy, whether defined or not. But here are the 5 in mine, and I'll go through them a little bit. So the first one is motivation. The second is perseverance. That's probably the one that I'll tie into this. The third is tolerance. The fourth is belief. And the fifth is attitude. Motivation. One philosophy that I have always believed in came to me through Jim Valvano. Some folks may be a little young for Coach Jim Valvano, but his was you plus motivation equals success. I heard a speech that he gave to the President's Club once to insurance salesmen back in the 1980s after his basketball team at NC State defeated the Houston Cougars. Really motivational talk. It was my mantra all the way through business school. But as I mentioned earlier, it assumes you know what success looks like. So it wasn't enough for me, but motivation is still really important. Perseverance, number 2. If something doesn't work, try something else. This came to me as I became a parent from my father-in-law. It was his best piece of advice. It does sort of resemble the Einsteinian insanity definition of, obviously, you continue doing something, you're not getting the outcome you're seeking. That's basically crazy. But in parenting, as with everything, and I think this is what answers your question, perseverance really is that thing where if this thing doesn't work, you just got to try something else. If you don't even have an idea, just do it. The third one is tolerance. And so this one comes to me from another hero of mine, my grandmother, Honey Rosenberg. This too shall pass. It's a Yiddish phrase, better understood as Gamze Yavor. And essentially, you have to weather this storm. You have to persevere and keep on grinding, but you also just have to get through this and know that everything is ephemeral. The fourth is belief. So because you can. I once decided to run a marathon. I didn't quite know why, and someone told me, because you can. And that has always stayed with me, having this belief in yourself. And fifth, attitude. Charles Swindoll, a pastor, had a poem on attitude. I was a temperamental kid. I was a perfectionist. I had a soccer coach that once gave me literally a printout of this poem. I probably still have it somewhere. Here's the most important part. I am convinced that life is 10% what happens to me and 90% how I react to it. I believe that's the case. So in this case as well, while perseverance was important, the attitude that we take in the face of failure, in the face of disappointment, is really critical. We know we can't change people's opinions. We know we can't change what they do. The one thing we can control, obviously, is how we show up and how we put ourselves forward.
This episode of As Unexpected is sponsored in part by Semester at Sea, a study abroad program for college students and adults on career breaks, sabbaticals, or retired, interested in learning and exploring the world together. Learn more about the Lifelong Learner program at www.semesteratSea.org. First of all, thank you, Alex, for sharing your 5 tenets. I need to first share with our audience how important I believe it is, and clearly Alex does too, to find your footing, your grounding. What's going to hold you solid in the midst of the storms the world presents? And you've got yours. You can articulate them well. You know the source for those that you can go back to when you need to. That perseverance, where'd that come from? Let me go back to it and resource it again. Love it. Love it. Related to the last one, the attitude. So I heard in a speech many, many years ago what this person called the 10-20-70 rule, which is very similar to what you call your 10 and 90. Basically, 10% you can control, 20% you can influence, and 70% you have no control or influence over. Now, you can play with the percents, right, as much as you want. But that 10%, to your point, is you. It's how you show up. That's what we have control over. Right? And it's the flip of what you just said. That is 90% of outcomes generally are about how we show up. So I 100% agree.
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, they do say 90% of it is showing up, and you just do have to show up. And then the 10% is how. And so the how you show up is going to influence how people respond to you and potentially make things go better in your favor, or decide that they're going to go worse. And so you do have that choice. And it's not a choice that you get to really mull over, except if you truly bake it into your person. And I know that I have the option when my children are acting up. I can use a teaching moment, or I can respond with wrath. And I definitely don't get it right. And they might say most of the time, but it's always a work in progress. Regardless of everything, we are always imperfectly working toward perfection.
So with that, this is a great transition point to the question posed by Kookie and Cam. So let's take a minute. Let's listen to the question they have. And then I'd love to hear your response to what they pose.
Expectations of employers have become increasingly high as job candidates are more selective about working for issues that align with their social values. What is your position on taking a stance on social issues that may be deemed as sensitive? And do you feel companies are responsible for being advocates on social issues, or is that not their place? Cookie, what do you think?
Yeah, that's a great question. I feel like there's probably a lot of mixed opinions about this. I feel like to an extent, companies do have a responsibility just because they are kind of, in a way, public figures that have an influence over people. I think at the end of the day, if your company is rooted in its values, and that's one of the things that is like part of your business proposition, it is your responsibility to kind of actually display that and take a stance on these kinds of things. But at the end of the day, at the same time, I see if your company doesn't normally take a stance or have values at the core of what it is, I can understand why you would maybe want to steer away from that. So it's kind of a complicated answer, I feel like.
Absolutely. Complicated for us, but maybe we'll get a better answer. Let's pass it on.
Okay, Alex. Cooking Cam, I've not given you an easy one. This is not a softball. What do you think?
It's an excellent question. Let me caveat my response by saying social issues is a fairly broad and unspecific theme, but I do, of course, understand what we're getting at. And here's my personal belief. Companies do not have an obligation to take a stance on social issues. However, they must be prepared to accept the consequences of both taking a position and not taking a position. And leadership teams must decide if and how they want to stand. Otherwise, they have to be prepared to fall. And more importantly, I think the people of the organization at all levels should have clarity on what type of company they are employed by and what type of company they wish to be employed by. For instance, does this company represent my values? I tend to think that this is codified in mission and value statements, and hopefully the actions of leadership serve to prove out and reinforce these. And in turn, it makes recruiting and performance evaluation interconnected. It serves as a platform to define or underscore the culture of the business and makes it easier for people to navigate their own careers and determine if a particular company is a good fit for their beliefs and values. I also think one last thought here, and we can get into it a bit more, is that as part of the recruiting process, candidates should ask these types of questions. How do you stand on social issues of progressive employers or prospective, not necessarily progressive, but certainly prospective employers, to see how progressive or not they may be and match them against their beliefs and their expectations?
So, first of all, thank you. That is just, in my mind, a profound answer, because you're not giving anybody an out. And I think that's the key. What you're saying is you have choice, right? A corporate entity, a small nonprofit like ours, we have a choice. We have agency in it. We just need to be prepared for the choice we make.
Absolutely. Again, you have to know who and how you're going to affect people, some for the better and some for the worse. But of course, if you have articulated your values and you know what you stand for, then you can choose how you wish to stand for them. In certain cases, certain leaders are not necessarily as publicly vocal, and that may or may not be their prerogative. They may feel compelled to step forward. They may not. That's okay. And these may be conversations and dialogue that has to happen internally, coming from the people to and between the leadership. However, there's no obligation to necessarily do that. But I think that if everyone has mission, values, things you can point to, and it's basically written on the door, you know before you go in there, almost a bumper sticker, whether this is a company that you feel proud to be a part of that stands for the same things that you do or not.
Spot on. Alex, this has been awesome. Thank you so much for sharing what I think is deep wisdom, coming through a lot of introspection, really formulating your 5 tenets, sharing that with our audience. I'd love it if you finished up with your one key piece of advice for all those that are living into their practice of leadership.
I think I'm going to go back into tenet number 5, your attitude. It is the one thing that you truly can control. It is very difficult to control. But if you actively practice focusing on and working on your attitude, you are going to show up in the world as who you want to be. And I think that even when unexpected things happen, you'll be better suited to face and deal with them, for better or for worse.
Exclamation point. Perfect. Thank you for spending the time with me today, Alex. And I hope to see you in New York City again soon.
No, me as well. Really, really enjoyed it. Thank you for having me, Scott.
This episode of As Unexpected is sponsored in part by Semester at Sea, a study abroad program where students visit 10 countries on 3 continents, all while taking 3 to 4 college classes through Colorado State University. See course offerings and upcoming voyage itineraries at www.semesteratsea.org.